This meeting is being recorded. It shouldn't be super long just because, it's just gonna be you and me and whatnot. Um, we had that conversation the other day about Syria, and I kind of wanted to throw it back to you on that. Because one of the things I've been thinking about, and I know we talked a little bit about this, is like, who cares? What's the point? All that kind of crap. But for me, I think more about like, so regionally, what does this mean? you know, Globally, what does this mean? Like regional, and maybe you can help me with this. So like regionally, it's like with Iran and Lebanon and Israel and Turkey. Like, what does all this Syria kind of stuff mean in that region? Like, what is this good for somebody, bad for somebody? Who's good, who's bad, who's kind of benefiting, who's not?
Let's start with the region because I think that's going to be the most like obvious and easy one to point out.
Hmm.
So the rebels that took over Syria, they're the main group, the one that took Aleppo, then took Hama, then Homs, and kind of did the main heavy lifting. It's called HTS for short.
Yep.
That's their acronym. So they're Turkish backed. So I guess you could say Turkey benefits the most in the sense that they now have a client in charge of Syria. They're now like since the Syrian civil war started, Turkey's been like harboring. I think it's like I want to say between 1 and 3 million Syrian refugees. I cannot remember
Yep.
the exact number
I've
off the
I've
top.
heard that number.
Yeah, but somewhere in that region. So now, last few days, they're like, okay, since the situation's over, we can start returning the now we've got a friendly government in Damascus. That means we can now fully focus on like dealing with the Kurds because the Kurds control a significant portion of Syria still.
Mhm.
So I would say definitely Turkey to start with benefits.
But this is interesting though, because yes, Turkey benefits, but the United States doesn't necessarily benefit, right?
Yeah, and that's
Which is
that's
it's like a weird like that's one thing I've been kind of noticing a lot, especially with Turkey kind of being in between us and Ukraine and Russia and down here in Syria, and even to an extent when we were in Iraq, they were definitely involved. It seems like they're always kind of there and they're always kind of doing stuff, and it may or may not necessarily be in the best interest of the United States.
oh yeah for sure. And that's been one of the big things in the past week. Like that's kind of had me so like focused on the situation. So excuse me. Uh, Turkey backs what's called the SNA, so it's another militia they're backing, and they've been focused solely on the Kurds.
Hmm.
And so, but then the last few days, there's been this huge battle for the city, and I want to attempt to pronounce it. If I mispronounce it, whatever. Menbiji. It's kind of like this city that's. I'm trying to think how it goes. Okay, so basically, Syria, the Euphrates River goes through it, and it cuts
Yeah.
off like basically about a third of Syria is on the other side of it. That's pretty much what the Turks, or not the Turks, the Kurds control, and they
Yep.
control bits and pieces over it. That city was one of them. So today, when the news thing came out, was there's ostensibly been a ceasefire agreed to. The Kurds will abandon that city to the SNA. So the big thing that's been reported this week is the Kurds kind of lead this faction. It's called the SDF or Syrian Democratic Forces.
Yep.
That's U.S. backed, big time. And so this week there's been a lot of reporting. It's like Turkey's back in this one faction. They're fighting the American backed faction. So now, and there was kind of some concern last few days because the Turks are running artillery and air support. We're running air support. So it's kind of like there was kind of some concern like we could potentially have a accidental blue on blue situation because the U.S. does have troops in that region, and then the Turks got artillery and their own
Yeah.
planes kind of in the region. So that was definitely a concern. So that was the Turks are doing their own thing, and like I think it's people got to remember for most of its history, this was Turkey's backyard. I mean, before the Ottomans collapsed, they owned all of that. So I mean, that's for
Hmm.
them. This is just kind of their back. It's kind of be like it'd be kind of like China playing around in Mexico. That's kind of the way they look at it because this is literally their backyard. So that's definitely a concern. So outside of Turkey benefiting, uh, I really from there I think it's kind of a for everybody else it's kind of trade offs. I think so. I mean, I don't. So there's been multiple reports now that the rebels have agreed with the Russians. They're going to let them keep their naval bases and air bases, and the it's kind of there's not really a full on name for it. There's Tartarus and Latakia, if I'm pronouncing that right. So it's mainly so those regions are mainly Alawite and Christian. So Syria is overwhelmingly majority Sunni Muslim, but those are the minority regions. That's where the Russians have their bases and stuff. So they've agreed with the Russians to keep their bases. So I mean, obviously Assad getting pushed out is kind of like a prestige blow. But if the rebels are going to let them keep their bases, materially, it's not that bad for the Russians. So I would kind of say they were kind of neutral.
Do you think
Uh,
that so do you think this helps um I guess soon to be Trump in kind of figuring out this whole Ukraine deal?
uh,
Because I mean this shows that Russia's overextended, okay?
I,
And I
I,
think this shows Iran that okay, like some of your stuff is happening. And it almost seems like okay, you could tie these two together and be like, hey, like, Iran, like this is not good for you. And so like, hey, let's cut a deal, regroup, everything like that. Same thing with Russia. Hey, we can't go down to Syria. What's another country that they're like super into with that's kind of we're battling with? Ukraine, obviously. But like, there's maybe some countries in Central Asia that maybe we're kind of wanting to play some moves on. So I mean, I don't know. I think you could do something with this, you know.
well, the reason I'm skeptical on that is because you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier. Turkey's always playing its own game. They're very much out for their national interest, and I can't objectively. I don't think anybody can fault them for that because I mean, you always got to look out for your nation's interest. I mean, there's really so that I wouldn't. And with the whole, like, I think I'd sent in our group chat the other day. I was like, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that I'm hearing, and like one of the things that I've heard, then there's been some reporting now on this. So before Assad even fell, like in the days leading up to it, there was a lot of reports that like, hey, behind the scenes, Turkey kind of sat down with the Russians and the Iranians. Were like, hey, let's come to a degree, let's come to some sort of deal with this. And there was reports like one of the terms was that like the Russians would get to keep their bases. They would, Assad would get pushed out, but the Russians get to keep their bases. So it's kind of like materially, did it really? And then so, and then
Do
there's
you,
now
but
been
do
some
you, do you
reports.
think the United States is going to support this new Syria?
They're definitely going to support the Kurds. That's something that we'll get into in a second because honestly that's a huge deal in of itself. But as far as the new Syria, there is now some talk. I saw it today that they're like we might take HTS off the terrorist list. So I mean they potentially will recognize the reality, but there's so many moving parts right now. I wouldn't say for sure anything because like okay so
Because this could be good. I mean, especially if the United States can get something for the Kurds, I think this could be good for America, and I think especially if, it all depends on how radical these jihadis are. I mean that's kind of an oxymoron, but it's like, it just depends on how radical they are. I mean, if they're willing to kind of, play ball. I could totally see the United States kind of getting them closer and then really kind of changing the game in the Middle East.
well you would think that, but the fact that Israelis have tanks like 20 miles from Damascus, so so the reporting and from what the Israelis had publicly admitted was Israel did not want Assad overthrown. They didn't. But obviously, Assad didn't like them. They didn't like Assad, but it was kind of a we'd rather have Assad than have a jihadi Turkish proxy force on our border. Because
Hmm.
so what the reporting was, and I think it was in I think Foreign Affairs or the Diplomat. I can't remember which. Is some one of those upper tier you know political rags. Israel's hope was that Assad would be weakened because that would obviously disrupt Iranian supplies to Hezbollah and Lebanon, but they didn't want Assad to completely collapse. So now that's Assad's completely collapsed. They've got this situation where HTS is now in Damascus. The Israelis launched their offensive into southern Syria, and since they've done that, it's come out that HTS is now talking to Iran too, and they're like, "Hey, we want to keep our relations, and we could potentially give you some other stuff." And then Israel came out today and threatened them and like, "Hey, if you allow the Iranians to keep supplying Hezbollah, we'll come after you." So it was like that's weird because
But,
nobody had said anything about that yet.
well,
So
I
that
know,
kind
but
of,
go ahead, go ahead.
but like so the point so like New York Times reported the other day that HTS and Iran have been talking, and like there has been some signs like HTS put out like a conciliatory statement towards Hezbollah the other day. So it's kind of like whatever geopolitical advantage Israel or us could get out of it, I think is being squandered because Israel automatically went towards like a ground assault. Because it's like if HTS comes to a deal with like Iran to like let them keep supplying Hezbollah. And I mean, like I've said, there's already reports they've agreed to let the Russians keep their bases. It's really like all the benefits they had out of Assad are still there. So I don't really, I wouldn't go as far as say it's a clear edge. Now, as far as like the Kurd thing, see, the important thing to remember about Turkey: Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. Not Britain, not Germany, not France. Turkey. Turkey is, I think it's close to 90 million people, so it's also like the second most populous country in NATO. So I mean, Turkey's until the last few years, it's really flown under most people's radars, but it really is
Mhm.
becoming a power in its own right. Like I think it's like 90% of global boron and there's another material. I think it may be in chrome comes from Turkey. So Turkey has like this huge lock on like drones and stuff now. Which I mean, if you paid attention, like the Armenian War back in 2020 or other stuff, you would know there was a lot of Turkish weapons cropping up in those conflicts.
But
Now,
so, but I guess kind of going back to kind of is this a win for the United States? I can see, you know, if Turkey, I think if the best upside here, Turkey maintains its presence with Syria, is able to move Syria, the new government in Syria, move them away from Iran, and use them as kind of pressure on the United States to push Israel basically back to the Golan Heights and basically to the status quo, and then just kind of start having friendly relations with Syria. Just kind of doing basically Assad, but plus a little bit more. And I think by doing that, you can also kind of push back on all of the Hezbollah stuff because that kind of sometimes rolls over into Syria. But I kind of see this, I'm like, this is kind of an upside, and for Syria, it's a win-win, or for Turkey, it's a win-win. It's like you're exerting more power and influence on the world's superpower. Okay. And then you also are kind of being able to suck it dry because as long as you cover the people in Syria, the people in Syria go in and goes to the Iranian side and completely start fucking with Israel, then they lose their leverage. And so I feel like for them, it's in their best interest to keep the new Syrian government on the United States side. And I think, here's the last upside: Israel. I think Israel, honestly, if I was their PR guy, I'd be like, hey man, you're not doing too hot. And you need to show people that you're not some invader. And I think going up there and be like, hey, we secured our borders, we kind of did our thing, now we're backing away. I think would be a good PR stunt for them. And I think that's an upside. For me, I'm like that's why you should want to have Syria and US sphere and with US ally sphere.
well, I, I want to push back on the idea that like Turkey having influence over Syria means it's necessarily in towards the United States because, like I said, Turkey is very much it's in NATO, but it's its own player. Like it very strenuously makes that distinction. And like you brought up Iraq earlier,
Hmm.
they're kind of forgotten now, but there was clashes between us and the Turks indirectly. There was actually a very well-known incident. I think in Turkey, to this day, it's still called like the bagging incident. So I think it was like a group of Marines ran into a Turkish reconnaissance team back in like 2003, I think it was, in Iraq, and they detained them and everything. And it was like this huge, like nationalistic
I
insult.
think I've
And
heard
then
of this.
it was a big thing. And then you probably heard about it recently because there was a case like a couple of months ago. A U.S. ship stopped in Turkey, and like a crowd of Turks. I think it attacked. It was like 14 U.S. sailors in a movie theater or something. Like they were bagging them and everything. It was like a huge diplomatic incident back in like I want to say it was October or September. I cannot remember which. So I mean, like the Turks, like they may be in our alliances, but they're their own kind of thing. So
Now, and this is the way they've been kind of acting. That's more kind of the recent thing, right? With Ogeron, right? Wasn't it before him that like they were kind of more kind of Eurocentric and more of just kind of like wanting to be in the EU and all that kind of stuff?
yeah, sort of back in the 90s, but that's kind of thing you got to keep
That's
in
what I
mind.
mean. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
90s, 2000s, and then that was kind of about it. It's like
Well,
once they applied to the EU and people were like, "Meh," they're like, "All right, fuck it, we're going the other way." You know?
and two, the thing you got to remember, Erdogan's been in power since like the 90s.
Oh, what's the 90s? Okay, I thought it was like the mid 2000s.
Yeah, he's been in there. So originally he did kind of like you got to think back in the 90s and stuff. The West was so ascended, it was, and now that like you've got like a alternative powers, like Turkey's kind of doing its own little. And I mean, it's got the population and military behind it. It is, and you got to remember like where Turkey is. That's always been some sort of power. Before, they used to be the Ottomans. Before that, they were the Byzantines. Before that, they were part of Rome. I mean, Turkey's very much always been. And two, you got to think about its strategic location. I mean, it's between the Middle East and Europe. It's got control of the Bosphorus. It's got a lot going for it. But anyway,
So Öcalan's been president of Turkey since 2014,
he
and
was.
then he was the prime minister from 2003 to 2014.
Yeah,
That's
something like
about
that.
right. That's about what I thought. Okay.
So he's been there for a hot minute,
Oh
and
yeah.
like, well, two, like I said, so there before Assad even fell, like in the days leading up, there was reporting that like the Turks and then there was reporting that came out like, yeah, they did have official meetings in Doha. So like the Turks did meet with the Russians and the Iranians, and they were like, they cut some sort of deal. What exactly the
Hmm.
deal was, there were some Russian sources reported. Like I said, like one of the terms they'd agreed on was like the Russians would keep their bases. So, and from the way the United States acted and the way Israel's acting, they very clearly did not expect this. And like I said, Israel did not want this. So I don't think that this necessarily happened on the terms they wanted. And like I said, like, so to kind of add to that, I don't know if you've seen this. I think I sent in the group chat. There's been multiple senators come out like publicly to attack Turkey for attacking the Kurds. Senator Graham was even threatening to put sanctions on them.
Yeah, you sent me that.
So it's like they really clearly did not expect this. I don't, from the way they're acting, I don't think they wanted this, especially Israel. And then the fact Turkey's using this to attack the Kurds is definitely adding some tension. So I mean, I just want to caution, like, just because Turkey's in NATO, don't think they're working in our interests. I mean,
Well, I know, and I guess for me, that's one thing that I've been thinking about recently is I'm like, they're always the one who's kind of like, meh, the anti-establishment kind of guy, and I'm just kind of like, why the fuck is it always Turkey? It's like Turkey, and you got like obviously now Hungary, and and I guess probably soon to be Romania, Slovenia, and all these other kind of places, but like Turkey was always kind of out there too, like they were always kind of doing their own thing. Um,
I think it's if I could throw out a theory, so like Germany, France, and the UK, they've basically been in the American sphere since at least 1945. So we'll put a nice little capstone on that. We'll say 1945. Hungary, it's recent. Turkey was always kind of at a distance. It was in NATO from the start, but Turkey's kind of, like I said, it's always been its own thing. It's big enough. It can kind of, Turkey was unlike, like France or Germany. We didn't occupy Turkey after the war. So, I mean, Turkey's always kind of had that ability to kind of assert itself in the way that other nations really couldn't. But, and to kind of, take it back to what we're talking about. So, when Assad fell, it wasn't HTS that was in Damascus. HTS was still at Homs, which is, I
right.
think, the second largest city. What actually took Damascus is called the Southern Operations Room, which I know that's a really weird name. So, back in 2018, with Russian support, Assad had defeated all what they call the Southern rebels or the Southern FSA. So, it was like the southern regions of Syria were in rebellion. They were part of the civil war. Assad managed to defeat them. And part of the reason they were able to defeat him is the Russians struck a diplomatic deal with those rebels that, like, hey, you lay down your arms, we'll reconcile you to the government, we'll vouch. So basically, the rebels agreed. It wasn't like a military defeat. It was like a diplomatic, like they agreed, like, there's no way we can win, so we'll just put down arms. So in the lead up to, like, HTS advancing on Hama, and then on Homs, all of a sudden, all those Southern rebels appeared back up. They just rose basically almost spontaneously. Like somebody made the points, like literally they took Damascus and 48 hours ago they didn't even exist. So
But one thing I think about a lot is we always talk about Russia and the United States and EU, NATO, all this other kind of stuff. What about China? I always think about it, and I know that they're kind of hesitant to get into this stuff. They'll get into it, trust me, especially in the Middle East, like with Saudi Arabia. But I guess
that's
I'm just kind of like, why, like, why in like in this kind of thing you don't see China kind of involved and being like sending troops or sending help or resources or anything?
so to make a point on China. China definitely has a reluctance in that sort of thing. It's
I
kind of
know.
institutional because I really don't want to take you down the weeds on this because we could go. But basically, 9/11, I can send you stuff on it. So after 9/11, China was like, okay, we've got this 20-year period. The U.S. like basically damn near nailed it. They were like, we got this 20 year period. The U.S. is going to be too busy. We can focus our efforts on rising ourselves up, and they did. I mean, they compare where China is today versus 2000. I mean, it's a clear difference. But and part of that thing was like they watched us have all our struggles in Iraq or Afghanistan. And you remember they were right across the border and back during Vietnam. So China just kind of has an institutional thing of like, we really don't want to repeat the same mistakes the U.S. has made. So that's one reason China is very much, they're not as big on sending troops and stuff. With that said, and this kind of ties back into where I was going with that about the Southern rebels a second ago. China leaned more towards the FSA and like other, not necessarily, well, I guess you could say the anti-Assad side. Now they weren't supporting them in the same way the U.S. supported them, but it was kind of like China's more close to like Sunni factions in the Middle East. Russia's closer to Iran, which is Shiite. Hezbollah is Shiite. Uh, the Assad regime, a lot of their power came from the Christians, the Alawites, the Shia. So China's more, and that's how China kind of has a better end with like Saudi Arabia and stuff. So China's kind of not, like I said, they're not sending troops, they're not really sending weapons, but they're kind of more like, okay, we get along with these new Sunni factions better than we could with Assad. Now, to take it back to where I was going with the Southern Rebels a second ago, so like I said, the Russians back in 2018, they struck that diplomatic deal, they got them to lay down their arms. So there's been some reporting that as part of that deal, the Russians put a lot of those ex rebels on their payroll. Like, hey, we'll pay you this amount of money. You guys don't revolt. Do whatever. And then, like I said, like it's weird. Like that southern faction, all of a sudden, within 48 hours, is taking Damascus. They didn't even exist. So now, like I said, like there's been a lot of reporting. Like, hey, the Turks struck some sort of deal with them. The only thing we know is probably the Russians get to keep their bases. And then, hey, this faction that actually took Damascus, at least some of them used to be paid by the Russians. So there's a lot going on there. I definitely feel like Turkey got, Turkey got Assad thrown out, and they got their new boys in. China, like I said, China's more willing to work with him, and then they kind of threw a bone to the Russians and the Iranians. So I'm kind of like, I don't want to go full conspiratorial, but they're definitely. And then there's a lot of ex-Syrian Arab Army guys who are like, yeah, we like. There was a lot going on behind the scenes, so I kind of do have the impression the fall of Assad was not just as simple as like the rebels taking Damascus. Like there was some diplomatic stuff going on behind the scenes.
Well, and I think I said this earlier. I think I said if I was Trump, but I think you can kind of see it now, and I think it could be Biden, it could be, somebody. I think I said, in a few episodes ago, I was like, somebody's going to make a play. Someone's going to make a play on something, and I think you're kind of basically what you're alluding to is people are making some plays that are happening in the Middle East,
Oh
and
yeah,
I think they're definitely taking advantage. And this could be the United States. I'm not, like I said, I'm not completely against it yet, but I could see where it's like, hey, Russia's tied up in Ukraine, Iran's and they're tied up with Israel. The United States says, "Hey, we're going to go in there and we're going to we're going to hit, one that kind of affects both of these guys." And being like, "All right, what are you going to do about it?" And really kind of doing a whole regime change and everything like that. Like I think there could be, you know, I think there could be a play that's been made. Like I said, I don't know if I would have picked that one, but I probably would have done Lebanon. But I think there's a few places where it's like, yeah, you could have made a play, and it looks like I think the United States or Turkey made a play in that
oh yeah,
region.
definitely Turkey. But now tying it back to Ukraine. So the main supply line to Ukraine actually goes to the Bosphorus. It's
Hmm.
actually um, so like if like I said, like there's a lot of indications the Iranians and the Russians and the Turks all sit down and came to some sort of deal. And so like it could have been, like I fully agree Turkey made a play, and I think how they made a play was they struck a deal. And what I'm going to be kind of curious to see. So like Turkey's been pushing hard in the last few months. They're like, we should just do a ceasefire on current lines in Ukraine. I think trying to defeat the Russians is stupid. Let's just do a deal, let's do a ceasefire, and the Russians get to keep what they currently have. So that was very interesting. They've been saying that at least since April, I think it was, leading into this. And I would not be surprised if part of that deal You're like, hey, Russia, like, you quit supporting Assad, you help us take Syria. Well, that supply into Ukraine might certainly have stuff start happening to it. Because I mean, it goes through the Bosphorus. Like most of Ukraine's supplies actually, and then you mentioned Romania earlier. Why that's such a big deal?
Yep.
Those supplies go through the Bosphorus, and then they land in Romanian ports. Romania is right next to Ukraine,
Yep.
overland by rail or truck to Ukraine.
Well, and I heard they're NATO's trying to build a new
Yes,
ship base in Romania, right? And so
big
it's like
big
that's
air base.
interesting. Interesting what you got going on there. I'd hate to see you not actually have any boats come here.
That's kind of where it's at. So I would not be surprised if like you mentioned what you said a couple of episodes ago. I think I said it too. Like 10, 20 years from now, we're going to be hearing a lot of interesting stuff that went on behind the
Oh
scenes.
yeah,
And
100%.
this
Oh, good.
and this whole thing just has that written all over it. Like I said,
Oh,
like
oh yeah.
and I made the point like the Russians get to keep their bases, and so and two, like I said, like they were already talking to the Iranians. That's been confirmed by New York Times. They're like, yeah, they've been talking at least for a couple of weeks or something. And now it came out the other day that like they had in private they had said like, hey, we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to letting you keep supplying Hezbollah through our territory. And then, like I said, Israel came out today and was like, yeah, if you do that, we'll come after you. So I mean, there's clearly some indications. There's you know you know there's some planning and talks, and it's kind of like if Iran can keep that supply line, keep Hezbollah going. It's like, okay, did Assad falling really hurt them? Russia keeping their bases, did that really hurt them? I mean, obviously there's the prestige hit. I mean, that's obvious. They've lost a lot of face, but it's like on the material side of things. I mean, if you're Russia, it's like, okay, I get to keep my bases. Turkey's going to help me get this, and it's going to diplomatically support us with Ukraine. If you're Iran, you're like, okay, I've lost all this, but now I can keep my supplies to Lebanon. I don't have to worry about supporting it because I mean, Iran was spending like tens of billions of dollars to keep Assad propped up.
Oh, dude, they're doing it to every group in
Yeah, like
basically the
and they
Levant.
and like in the Civil War, they've lost like thousands of guys. So now it's like, yeah, it sucks. I mean, we kind of all that money was for nothing, but it's also like now we can use that money towards other stuff. Like now they can focus that on keeping Iraq in their sphere, and then like I said, if they keep their overland supply line to Hezbollah, I mean, really, I mean, like I said, like obviously this is embarrassing. Like a lot of people have keyed into that, but I'm like materially on the ground, I'm not really seeing. Like the Russians are still running operations in Syria. Like there was a thing
Yeah,
today, like they blocked. So there's this Arab city in the Kurdish areas. It's like Qamalishi or something. I
yeah.
know I'm mispronouncing that, but whatever. And like the Russians actually deployed and prevented us from accessing an airport. So I mean, it's like the Russians are still running operations in Syria. So it's like there's a lot going on that doesn't mean there's the stuff you'll see in the newspapers, and then there's stuff that you're just if you know who to talk to or you know what to watch for, you're like, okay, this is interesting, shall we say?
So if the U.S. is involved, is it Trump or is it Biden?
Oh, I would
That's
definitely say
Go ahead. I know you're going to say Trump.
nah. I wouldn't say Trump. I would say
Really?
this would definitely be a Biden thing
So
because
you think Biden's kind of like on the way out? He's like, hey, like we're going to clean some of this stuff up.
well, like I said, I kind of think this was from the way we've been acting, and definitely the way the Israelis are acting. This caught them by surprise. Like there was like the day before Damascus fell, there was a news report there like, yeah, we're thinking like they'll fall in like a couple of weeks or something. And then, like I said, like 8 hours later, Damascus has fallen. So like this really, the speed of it caught them by surprise. I definitely think, like insofar as like I don't think we caused it. I think it was other players that caused it. But I definitely think in terms of like who would be interested in like this whole situation, it's more like Biden because like Trump is Trump, but he's definitely come out like repeatedly said like, well, we don't need to get involved. We don't need to get involved. And part of the reason for that is Trump and Erdogan have a pretty decent relationship.
As I said,
Now,
that's what I thought.
so they do, and then but here's the thing: is like U.S. interests are more with the Kurds. Trump really does not care about the Kurds. Like there
Yeah,
was, I don't know if you remember back in 2017, like we basically cut a deal with the Iraqis, let them deal with the Kurds in Iraq, and then Trump. One of the big things in his first term is that he kept trying to get a pullout from Syria, and the Pentagon fought him out the whole time. So I mean, like I definitely think he's kind of just of the opinion, like, why are we there? Like, what does it matter? So I don't think this is more of a Republican thing. But now, the Kurdish situation and this kind, like there's so many moving parts to that. That one is super interesting. So like it, where to begin with that? So like okay, so like I said, it's SDS.
But let me just ask you this question.
Mhm.
So, if Biden and Israel were caught off guard, but this does kind of benefit them in some way, like I that's why I'm kind of like I feel like almost the status quo has shifted more, at least in the U.S. side, as a win. Now, who knows? This could be like just a even worse failed state. Like people say, it could be a Libya, and just gets even worse. But I feel like like people like I feel like kind of like we were saying, like deals are being made, and I feel like that the United States is somewhere involved. And I think maybe they were like, hey, we're gonna let Turkey do this because we don't want to get our hands on it. And we're gonna let them negotiate because we've done that before with the I think of the Ukraine like wheat and everything like that, right? They were like, hey, like we're gonna make a deal here. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was like, hey, we're gonna make a deal here, and then we'll come back here and fix like Ukraine's next on the list. Um, and I could totally see that happening. Just being like, hey, like let's fix this, let's do this, and then them coming back and doing something in Gaza. Like, I think that yeah, the Russia's still running stuff, but this has definitely been a net negative to them.
I definitely think it's something we're gonna like. I'm definitely in a wait and see approach on a lot of things. I mean, if it does fully get confirmed, they get to keep those bases, which they are acting like they're going to keep those bases. And then to have that, it kind of depends on like what Turkey does as far as like Ukraine. So, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to it. But the
So what are
reason
you
I'm
gonna follow? What are you following? Like as stuff's coming in, you're like, hey, I want to know if they form a constitution. You know what I mean? Like something like that. Like, what are you following on all this? Like, what are you seeing? Like, hey, like I'm keeping an eye out for this because it'll change the game.
keep watching Turkey's statements on
Okay.
like Ukraine. That's a big one. Watch what Israel does in southern Syria and how HTS responds to that. Because, like I said, right after as Israel's done that, the HTS is there's been more and more reporting that HTS is talking to the Iranians like, hey, like we want to keep our relations, and it's pretty obvious. It's like, okay, if Israel's taking our territory, who do we need to turn to fight Israel? Obviously, Iran. So I mean, there's that. So that's another thing to watch. To watch for what HTS does with Hezbollah as far as their like relations with each other. But then the center point to all of this, and it's why it's so I think interesting in of itself, is the Kurdish situation. Because like I said, the main U.S. backed faction in that region is the Kurds. But now the Kurds the predominant faction in SDF, but SDF is a multi
Right.
ethnic body, so it's like the region they control. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually majority Arab. Like the Kurds are a very large minority, but it's mostly Arab.
Right.
So like I said, the Turks kicked them out of that one place, and now there's been a lot of reporting. They're like, hey, we're really in danger. Like the Kurdish airstrikes, artillery, it's taking its toll on us. And then so a lot of these Arabs went SDF because their only options were ISIS, Assad, or join the Kurds. And so like we kind of pushed a lot of these factions to join with the Kurds. But now Assad's gone. ISIS is mostly defeated. So it's like there's now been multiple cases where like Arabs are like revolting against the Kurds. They basically got kicked out of a place called Deir ez-Zor, which is along the Euphrates, and why it's so critical, and why Israel and us are like so freaked out about the Turks going after the Kurds. So Deir ez-Zor used to be controlled, up until Assad fell, it was controlled by the government, and Iran ran supplies through there. That's how they had the supply out to Israel, or not Israel, to Lebanon. So now that like the Arabs in that region like revolted, like there was actually multiple units like defected from the SDF to the new Syrian government. So it's like that's kind of the connection point there. Is because Israel and us are like looking like, okay, if HTS has got that land route again, the Kurds, so the Turks are beating up on the Kurds. The Arabs are starting to revolt and join, in support of HTS. And it's like, okay, if HTS has this alliance with Iran made, Iran can be moving supplies through like they were before. So that's why everybody's like so hyper focused on the Kurds right now. So that overall situation, I would highly recommend watching.
So last question. If you were Biden, what would you do?
Really, nothing. I when it comes down to it,
Or and we'll broaden this to Gaza, Gaza, Ukraine, Syria. What would you do? Here's your landscape. Here's what you're seeing. I know. I think Blinken's actually heading to Syria, to Turkey, and I think Qatar.
yeah.
Um,
Well, as we were
you
no,
know,
well,
like you got a month left, month and 10 days left in office. What are you gonna do? What are your options? What do you think you can get done? Is there any deals that can be made? What would you do? What would you be looking at?
if you're Biden, it's like you said, you got a month left. Nobody's going to be cutting a deal with you because they got to deal with the new
Okay.
guy coming in January. So I mean, I just fundamentally feel that the fundamental American interest, to repeat myself there, uh, Syria's right next to Turkey. It's almost right. I mean, besides Iraq, which is an Iranian like aligned regime anyway, like
Hmm.
they're all right there. They're right next to it. It matters a lot more to them than it will ever matter to us. They've got, the Turks got their people in power. The Iranians still kind of have pull with some factions, and like I said, like they're kind of cutting deals between each other. I mean, we spent all this time trying to overthrow Assad, and now we have like, I mean, it may not be,
Now he's gone and we don't know what to do.
yeah, it's that, but it's also like HTS. I mean, it's not ISIS, but like the dude that's running it, Julani,
Yeah, he was
was
part of
literally,
Al Qaeda, wasn't he?
yeah, he was out. He was he. So back in 2003, he went and fought our troops for like years. He was
Oh,
the
I know.
he was
He
deputy.
was in Iraq too,
Yeah,
and
that's where.
like fighting and stuff. And it's like this is the guy that now we're having to negotiate with, and
Like,
it's like George W. Bush is rolling in his grave. He's like I went to fucking Afghanistan and now we got Al Qaeda in charge of Syria. Like what the fuck is going on?
well, it's like he wasn't just in Al Qaeda in Iraq. He was the deputy commander. Like
Hmm.
Al Baghdadi, the guy that led ISIS, was his superior.
Yeah.
So I mean, like he's obviously he's presented this moderate thing, and like we'll see how that goes. Like I'm inclined to think there might be some truth to that, but I don't think it's in the sense that we would like it. But
I was gonna say and we'll end this on this. We'll end it here. Um, I feel like I kind of got a little hope. Like I feel like the playbook of you're a terrorist group, you take control, and you basically just kind of, you know, aren't gonna have to deal with any of this stuff. You're just gonna have this, crazy, wild, wild west. I don't think that's the motive anymore. I think a lot of these countries or a lot of these groups like him, like they're like, hey, we want to get into power and we want to actually make this change. So I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up kind of being like, hey, like we're gonna be cool. We're gonna, what does the West need to not get pissed off of this? Kind of like with the Taliban. Like, hey, we're not gonna do these things and we're cool. You just got to leave us alone. And I think there's real appetite for that. And I think to leave it here, I think that's what they're gonna be looking at. Is like, hey, what do we need to do? Okay, we don't need to go talk to Israel. Okay, done. All right. So I'll leave it there, and we'll talk about this later.
see you, man.
See you.